Here is a riddle. What is it that we're happy to lose every day and not at all surprised to have returned the next day? And of course, the answer is consciousness. It's the most natural of our possessions, and as with the very air we breathe, it becomes an object of concern only when the supply of it seems to be threatened. However, as natural as it stands as a very serious threat to any number of core convictions and assumptions in both philosophy and science. My aim in these 12 lectures is to make clear just what it is about consciousness that serves as such a challenge to these very convictions and core assumptions. Additionally, I hope to make clear any number of peculiar features of consciousness, often overlooked as we enjoy its many gifts. Along the way, there will be opportunity to examine the related phenomenon of self-consciousness and the vexing question of just how it is we know that someone else has consciousness, and the quite serious question of just why we ever needed consciousness in the first place. So to express the aims of this series of lectures in the most general terms, I'd say that with respect to the matter of consciousness, our core questions will be these. What is it? How does it come about? And what is it for? Well, time now to get into it. Popular speech is rife with references to consciousness. Students often admit that during a lecture, perhaps not unlike this one, they were half-conscious, their minds wandering near and far. Even without the benefit of Freudian psychology, persons often leave room for the possibility that something said or done was unconscious in its origins, fulfilling some unconscious motive. The act of daydreaming reflects, by contrast, on a vividly conscious life. Then, too, there's the patient in the emergency room, a source of great concern owing to the loss of consciousness. And in still other contexts, we tend to think of consciousness and sleep as opposites, though less sure of how to classify the dreams we seem to be living through. Now, some of us are old enough to recall that mission of the elect back in the late 1960s to raise consciousness. Any number of demonstrations was to be consciousness raising, though at the time the desired effect seems to have fallen some distance, if I may say so, from my own consciousness. I will include some of these topics in later lectures, but I will not begin the series on any of these themes, interesting though they are. Instead, though it may seem odd at first, I prefer to begin with the topic of, ready, zombies. Now, as it happens, these creatures, or entities, as they are featured in grade B Hollywood films, raise very interesting questions in philosophy of mind about the nature of consciousness itself. In the Hollywood version, zombies come about through a form of voodoo. They are the walking dead, the undead but still not living, for they are lacking souls. Nonetheless, these soulless creatures do many of the things the rest of us do. They carry packages. They find their way around. Some might save cats caught in trees or carry children out of burning buildings. So if it's the Hollywood version, we've got reason to believe that what zombies accomplish is accomplished without consciousness. I believe the old 1968 thriller, The Night of the Living Dead, still enjoys something of a cult following. Using the internet and Google, I discovered that the cast of relative unknowns included Marilyn Eastman, who played Helen Cooper, the bug-eating zombie. I like this next one particularly. Charles Craig was the newscaster zombie. 2 members of the posse were zombies, as was the cemetery caretaker. Note then the diverse employment possibilities that Hollywood made available to these soulless beings. And this surely gives pause, long enough for the appearance of, yes, the philosopher's zombies. Now, philosophical zombies are different from the Hollywood version. They are created to test certain notions we have about the essence of mental life and the properties that such a life must have to qualify as consciously lived. We might ask whether an entity that saves a cat caught in a tree or a child in a burning building might be credited with, in some sense, a mental achievement, though perhaps not a conscious achievement. More prosaically, we might ask whether an adding machine, yielding correct sums, is satisfying the criteria by which we designate acts as calculating or computational. After all, these are among the actions characteristic of mental life, and to that extent we might say that devices performing such tasks are properly regarded as functioning in, let's say, a mental way, or at least intelligently. Nonetheless, we have no reason to believe that such devices do so with consciousness. Now, rather more scrupulous than Hollywood filmmakers, philosophers are careful to distinguish between and among different kinds of zombies. Guzen Guzeldura, some years ago, in a very lively essay titled "3 Ways of Being a Zombie," summarized various ways of configuring such entities and then understanding their nature in a philosophically rich way. In principle, one might make a device that is indistinguishable from conscious human beings in the way it behaves. It does, and perhaps even says, just the things we do and say, though its internal machinery or circuitry is nothing like our own and may even be based on principles utterly unlike those that govern human biology. Except for its gross behavior, we would not mistake this sort of thing for a neighbor, and probably would not experience either empathy or sympathy were we to see it taken apart in the machine shop. Now, a better fit than the behavioral zombie is what we call the functional zombie. It not only does and says what we do and say, but its underlying systems function as ours do. We might think of such creations as a set of prosthetic limbs and sense organs, designed to respond to the stimulations and conditions that give rise to our own behavior. They not only accomplish what we, by way of our own conscious life, might accomplish, but they appear to do so in the right sort of way. Now contrast this with a restaurant robot that might be configured to heat the soup on the stove, only then to pour the contents into the washing machine. We would see in this a real gap in its functional equivalence to an actual cook. The right sort of functional zombie is one that may well translate any number of biological functions into electrical input-output operations, each of its subsystems functioning as ours do, but without the addition of conscious awareness of anything. Where our receptors and neurons are activated by external physical stimulation, so too are the sensing devices of the functional zombie, but the achievements do not include or require anything by way of consciousness, let alone self-consciousness. Now, most interesting of the three is the third kind of zombie, the physically identical zombie, whose structure matches human anatomy cell for cell, organ for organ. It looks like one of us. Its inner workings are just like ours. It behaves as we do. It's physically a veritable double. Were we to see one of these coming down the street, we would be more inclined to greet it than to run away from it. Were we to witness an operation on it, we certainly would hope that the loss of blood could be controlled and that a full recovery would soon follow. Now, these three types of zombie capture the various ways philosophers have attempted to dissolve the seeming mystery of consciousness. One solution to the problem of consciousness is behavioristic. X is properly regarded as conscious to the extent that its behavior is relevantly like that of anything that is regarded itself as being conscious. Whatever it is about our neighbor's behavior that finds us imputing consciousness to her, we are permitted to use these same public data in imputing it to comparably behaving entities, including zombies and robots. Other philosophers are inclined to impose a more stringent set of criteria. Not only must there be behavioral similarities of the right sort, but these must come about in the right sort of way. That is, the behavior must express underlying physiological processes of just that sort that underlie our own actions and our own speech. To the extent that the device functions the way we do, we're permitted to regard it as conscious in the relevant sense. Now suppose, however, that we have an actual, even a cellular copy of a human being made up of biological bits and pieces and functioning in just the manner of our own biological systems, that third zombie. Suppose further that it behaves as we tend to behave. We may have little reason now to withhold from it the property of consciousness. But then we face a dilemma. This entity, entirely like our own in its underlying systems, an entity that behaves as we do, nonetheless has no consciousness as we would understand that property or state. The conclusion we'd have to reach is that consciousness simply cannot be explained in terms of physical properties. If this other being shares all of our features at the level of very physical foundations, but is lacking in consciousness, which we have, then the physical foundations are unable to account for consciousness itself. So there's a dilemma. But if not physical properties, what other properties are there? Must we invoke ghost-like properties? Consider now the other horn of the dilemma, a system entirely physical, but nonetheless conscious. Now the question is this: how a system entirely and solely physical comes to have this defining mental property? It should not be surprising that some philosophers have seemingly avoided the dilemma by simply rejecting the very idea of zombies in any terms that would settle issues in philosophy of mind. In a carefully argued essay titled Zombie Killer, Nigel Thomas argued that the very foundational premise on which the zombie examples are constructed are defective. The premise, as we've seen, is that a zombie behaves and functions as we do, but does so without consciousness. Zombies are stipulated as not having consciousness, in that their representation of the external world, whether a world of roses or music or milk chocolate, is not accompanied by qualitative features of our conscious commerce with the things that bring about such experiences in us. As Nigel Thomas says in his article, and I quote, "A zombie can tell you that the rose before it is red, and it will wince and hastily withdraw its hand if it touches a hot stove. However, unlike us, it never experiences the quintessential redness, the raw feel of red, or the awfulness and misery of burning pain." Close quote. If we accept what is now widely endorsed by scientists and philosophers, namely that our own conscious experiences are nothing more than the result of our own brain and bodily functions, then zombies are indeed problematical. Again, in Nigel Thomas's words, and I quote again, "If zombies, functionally equivalent to conscious human beings, are a real conceptual possibility, then functionalism must be false, because we are admitting that two functionally indiscernible beings could be mentally different. One is conscious and the other is not. Likewise, if zombies physically equivalent to conscious human beings are a possibility, then physicalism must be false." Close quote. Functionalism, however, is a perspective on mind that lends itself to more than one meaning. William James, the great William James, caused a stir among philosophers and psychologists about 100 years ago with his controversially titled essay, "Does Consciousness Exist?" In James's wonderfully affecting style, his no-nonsense candor, he put his case directly, and I'm going to avail myself of a lengthy quotation from psychology's master craftsman. So here's a quote from William James. I shouldn't even have to give the name. The quote itself would disclose the identity. Quote, "I believe that consciousness is on the point of disappearing altogether. It is the name of a non-entity and has no right to a place among first principles. Those who still cling to it are clinging to a mere echo, the faint rumor left behind by the disappearing soul upon the air of philosophy. To deny plumply that consciousness exists seems so absurd on the face of it. I mean only to deny that the word stands for an entity, but to insist most emphatically that it does stand for a function. There is, I mean, no aboriginal stuff or quality of being contrasted with that of which material objects are made, out of which our thoughts of them are made. But there is a function in experience which thoughts perform, and for the performance of which this quality of being is invoked. That function is knowing. Consciousness is supposed necessary to explain the fact that things not only are, but get reported, are known. Whoever blots out the notion of consciousness from his list of first principles must still provide in some way for that function's being carried on." Close quote. Very long quote, very important one. James is no skeptic about thought. Whatever term we choose to employ, we recognize that the difference between the mere registration of an event and our knowledge of it, our knowing it, is a real distinction. There may be many things we know of which we are not conscious, and this is especially obvious in the matter of knowing how. One who knows how to ride a bicycle is not conscious of all the sensory and motor adjustments and coordinations on which the performance depends. But although we can know how without conscious awareness, it would seem contradictory to claim that we could know this without conscious awareness. Still, it remains an important question as to what this awareness adds to anything. If the system without consciousness can process information and solve problems and achieve significant ends, of what value is the addition of a direct awareness of all this? It's certainly not a requirement for further learning or for memory, at least if all we mean by learning and memory is the acquisition and retention of information. A computer's memory can take on whole megabytes of new information, and a file cabinet can store many pounds of the same. So it would seem that neither the computer nor the file cabinet is especially limited by being unaware of the functions it is serving. Well, in this manner of speaking, the computer achieves much without knowing anything, just as the file cabinet stores much without remembering anything. So just what is consciousness good for, after all? And if zombies were capable of hopefulness, why should any self-respecting zombie hope to be conscious? Now, in one respect, just to ask the question, what consciousness is good for, is already to beg a very important and significant question, and that's the question of whether the best account of those defining features of human nature are to be understood, must be understood, within an essentially evolutionary context. If the only way we can explain such a property is by way of the selection pressures dictated by evolutionary theory, then when we come to a property such as consciousness, the right question to ask is, what is it good for? What kind of advantage does it confer? What would be the disadvantage for creatures that could do all the things zombies do, but not possess consciousness into the bargain? If it isn't too close to heresy these days, I would want to record my own skepticism, or at least my own reservations, about the proposition that any and every psychological property, every feature of mind and mental life, must finally be validated against the assumptions of evolutionary theory. There may be respects in which it's quite a nice thing to be conscious of one's own life and labor, though the fact of it may confer no evolutionary advantage whatever. In any case, we're certainly permitted to examine the nature of consciousness in a spirit of neutrality as regards theories about its value. It's of obvious value at the personal level to the one whose consciousness it is. Of course, the more refined conceptions of evolutionary influences do not require that every property be patently useful, or even useful at all. Some theorists have advanced the notion of evolutionary spandrels, S-P-A-N-D-R-E-L-S, borrowing here a term from architecture. Stephen Gould and Richard Lewontin developed this idea a number of years ago in a paper they titled The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. Don't you love it? The intersecting arches in the dome of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice result in handsome, repeating triangular spaces. But these are, to use a technical term, epiphenomena of the arrangement of the arches themselves. They are not functional in any structural architectural sense. Well, consciousness, it might be argued, is an epiphenomenon of evolution, or so the argument would go. The fully adapted being is akin to the zombie, but owing to the formation of that being, consciousness appears as a byproduct, as an epiphenomenon. Thus, consciousness may be regarded as a product of evolution, but with no embarrassment to the theory, just in case consciousness has no real function at all. On this account, the zombies are like the rest of us, but without spandrels. And to which I would be inclined to say, with respect to a theory of that sort, let the buyer beware. Well, in some respects, we already know, if not personally, then by observations or reports about other persons, what it might be like to be a zombie. It might be something like sleepwalking. And we do know some things about somnambulism. It's more common in early childhood. It drops off quite sharply by the teen years. It has a fairly strong hereditary linkage, but in general, those suffering from the condition are otherwise in good health. On average, episodes of somnambulism last a matter of minutes, seldom more than 15 or 20 minutes. The form somnambulism takes varies from a placid touring of the bedroom or the house to fitful sprints as if attempting to resist capture. Zombie-like, the child's glassy eyes are open throughout, staring blankly but seeing well enough to avoid objects and to reach seemingly intended destinations as the child quietly roams the house. Typically, there's no recall of any of these somnambulistic episodes. Well, what is it that we would lose were life to be one long sleepwalk? What is it that's unavailable to an otherwise functional problem-solving device, just in case it is lacking in awareness of itself and of its own performance? Some answers begin to dawn even as we raise the question. Thus unaware, the device must also have no conception of consciousness itself and of self-consciousness in others. no awareness that there are other minds. Now, what form of interaction might be possible among such entities? Could there be crime and punishment? Could there be moral improvement? Could there be an aesthetic dimension to life, not to mention a striving toward what is rather ambiguously referred to as a state of transcendence? The somnambulist doesn't know what it's like to be a somnambulist precisely because somnambulism strips one of those epistemic resources that let us know what it's like to be a certain kind of being. Somnambulists can do things, but they can't know things. Except in an attempt to be an interesting disputant, none of us would claim to be as willing to live this sort of life as the one we are living by way of consciousness. Not because the other life isn't worth living, but because it's not as rich a life. Now, in our faithfulness to the received scientific authority of our own time, we wisely consult the brain sciences and evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to benefit from a teaching that might deepen our understanding of consciousness as some sort of depersonalized property. All this as if we wish to know more about how the heart actually moves blood around, or how the eardrum is protected when loud sounds are delivered. We are nonetheless confident that unlike eardrums and cardiac physiology, our consciousness is our own, privately, known uniquely, solely by the one whose conscious life it is. Moreover, that its personally known contents can only be described for the benefit of others, but not directly known by them. Well, what then of so-called multiple personalities, or of such dissociative disorders that might have someone conscious of being someone else, or of states of fugue and delusion, or stages of infancy at which there is consciousness but no basis yet for its personalization, or that quarter or third of life when sleep renders each of us unconscious, or dream states in which we enter a paradoxical state of strikingly heightened consciousness only to awaken to the fact that we had been sleeping all along. Or that Freudian landscape in which much that is vividly apparent is but a camouflage and a deception. What are we to make of research on autoscopy, where persons somehow see themselves from a place distant from their actual bodies? And near-death experiences in which conscious awareness seems to survive the termination of just those biological processes on which mental life is presumed to depend. It's certainly doubtful that all this and more will be credibly subsumed under the heading spandrel. In light of all this, it's somewhat surprising that the very word consciousness did not take on its current meaning in English until quite late in the 17th century. John Locke's essay concerning the human understanding appeared in 1690 and made use of the term consciousness in a rather new way. The roots of the word, after all, are the Latin cum and scio, to know in the sense of what is shared within a community. Hobbes earlier would say that what is conscious is just what is understood in common. He put it this way, somewhat quaintly, quote, "Where two or more men know of one and the same fact, they are said to be conscious of it one to another." In Locke's work, consciousness takes on its private character, its contents found only through introspection by a mind able to examine its own contents and that of no other mind. How different is Locke's sense from Hobbes's. Consciousness, says Locke, quote, "is the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. Can another man perceive that I am conscious of anything when I perceive it not myself? No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience." Close quote. The word would wait for its Chinese equivalent until the 19th century, and this presumably is not because the Chinese lacked introspective powers of mind until the 19th century, let alone a language insufficiently rich to convey whatever is conveyed by the English word. Surely it's not the case that no one had engaged in introspection until Locke wrote his essay and used consciousness in a special philosophical sense. The word is problematical enough, and matters seem to become ever more unsettled when we add to it a self in order to come to grips, as I will in the next lecture, with self-consciousness. We see then that the topic in these lectures has had a seemingly sudden birth, followed by a philosophically meandering journey, only to face in our own time challenges as to its reality, let alone its importance. Clearly, we have our work cut out for us.